Oh, hi there again. Social Studies 20-1. Source number two, we're looking at more sources regarding illiberalism. Again, these sources are from the January 2019 diploma exam. So if you'd written the exam, this is what you would have been up against. Interpreting sources is a very good way to learn about the content in social studies. I really hope you're keeping up with it. There's source two. I'll give you a few seconds to look it over, and then we'll take up the source. Okay, that's what I would be going after. So the blue highlighted section, many human rights abuses in Canada. You might talk about previous examples of human rights abuses that we've looked at. So that it could include the internment of the Ukrainian Canadians, internment of the Japanese Canadians. I would briefly talk about those, maybe talk about the numbers involved if you can remember. And then, you would get into the appalling example they're talking about, which of course is the assimilation of Aboriginal kids through the residential school system. So even though we don't learn a lot about residential schools in 30-1, you did back in 10-1. And so you'd have to recall some of that information to attack this part of the source. You would talk about the purpose of the residential schools, talk about the time frame, late 1800s. The last one actually closed as late as 1996 in Canada. And you might talk a bit about why they had the schools and what went on in them. Again, the intent was to assimilate them, to make them like British European culture. The schools began at the peak of ethnocentrism and imperialism, and it seemed at the time, I guess, a natural extension for a mother country to do to assimilate their colony. So they tried to assimilate Aboriginal kids. And of course, as you learned, they would have had to have attended the residential school. It was illegal not to attend. They were roomed and boarded at the school. So what that means is that they went to school and they also stayed at the school overnight and then they went back the next day. So they were really cut off from their family, their culture, their friends, which exposed them to all kind of abuse like you would have learned back in social 10-1. They had to learn English, they had to learn to read and write English, they took on an English name, a Christian name, they had to abandon their religion and culture and embrace British religion and culture. So you would talk about, the assimilation process and what would have happened in those residential schools. And then it goes on to say that, this wasn't the only time this has happened in Canada's past. Uh, the, the policy of eugenics. So people with developmental disabilities were forcibly sterilized so they couldn't have kids. And you would establish why this was a violation of human rights. Talk a bit about that. If you know any numbers involved with that, you would talk about them at that point. If you know the dates involved, you would talk about them. We're talking about 1960s, 1970s. And if you had already looked over the eugenics article that I gave you to read, you could bring a lot more to the table too. And finally, the source ends with, the Canadian government's got to take responsibility. They need to atone for what they've done. And so talk about what that would mean. What does it mean to take responsibility? What does it mean to atone? You'd have to talk about, yes, there will be a formal apology, a redress, maybe education programs, maybe money to help the psychological suffering that people would have been through during this time, help them get over the human rights abuse, which would bring a lot of, I would imagine, psychological trauma that you could talk about. And only this way can we ensure that there are not future injustices. So in other words, we don't repeat the past in Canada because we would have learned from it. We took responsibility, we atoned for it, and it shouldn't happen again. In terms of your links, well, of course, we're talking about rule of law. The government put itself above the rule of law when they established the residential schools. I mean, those kids did not go there because they wanted to. Their families certainly didn't want them to go. clearly the government putting itself above the rule of law. They infringed and took away people's civil liberties, their rights and freedoms, in both cases of the residential schools and the policy of eugenics. And you might talk about self interest in that individuals were denied their own right to self interest because the government was putting its self interest first. In terms of perspective, you're looking at a quote that is clearly challenging liberalism. You know, liberalism needs to do more. We need to atone for mistakes in the past that were illiberal, to make sure that they don't happen again. So clearly, you have an individual who is challenging and even criticizing liberalism. You know, we often think of Canada as a modern 21st century democratic free country, which it is for the most part. And it's hard to believe. It surprises people that in Canada's past were acts of illiberalism. And if there's acts of illiberalism in Canada, you can be sure there are acts of illiberalism in other democratic countries too. So you get someone challenging or criticizing, critiquing liberalism. I can't think of much else you might put into the source. I think that pretty much covers it. But I'm sure you have more and better answers than I do anyway. So thanks for listening. The next source is going to be a cartoon concerning women's rights, the women's suffrage movement. So you can stay tuned for that tomorrow.